Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Welcome, everybody. I know that there will be a fair amount of people who will join us, but we want to make sure we get through all of this content because we have a lot to share with you today. And I'm just so glad that you have come back to our our further conversation about trauma. And I'm grateful for Shannon to be so willing to come back and continue this conversation with us. So thank you. We're talking today about radical resilience and building a trauma response. And I hope that's something that you're really interested in and want to hear more about. And please feel free to throw something in the chat if you have something to offer or you have a question. More than happy to answer all your questions. Okay, so to get through the NTAC stuff, this is as part of our session, we must provide you with this disclaimer. This presentation was prepared by NTAC under a cooperative agreement from SAMHSA. But while this event is supported by SAMHSA, the contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA, HHS, or the US government. While we hope there aren't any security issues, and I've never, in all the time I've been doing family exchange, there's never been a security issue, but in the case that occurs, this session will be immediately ended and you'll be notified by email how to rejoin a new session. Again, it's never happened, but we have to be prepared. Thank you again for attending one of our NTAC sessions. NTAC is the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for children, youth, family, and family mental health. Listed here are all of the incredible national partners that have come together to utilize their expertise and their subject matter knowledge to help inform the field by creating products, resources, and sessions like this one to enhance the behavioral and mental health fields. And then as a center, our vision is that all children, youth, and families living with and impacted by mental health challenges will have access to the resources and opportunities they need to thrive in a comprehensive and equitable system of care. We serve a wide cross-sector audience, including everyone from state leaders to providers to school workforce, infant and early childhood mental health providers, community-based providers, peer supervisors, family partners, and youth partners, and much, much more. So we're really glad that you're all here for this event. Before we get started, I wanted to address some of the commonly asked questions that come up during the sessions, all sessions from NTAC, and to let you know. You will receive a certificate of completion from this event, and it will come from Bridget's email address, which is outlined here. And you can get a copy of this event, a copy of the slide presentation. It came with your reminder or notice of the event, but it will also come in a day or two. It'll come with again from Bridget with a copy of the recording there, so you know that it's being recorded. It will be attached to ntacmentalhealth.org on their resources page. So if you're interested, you missed part of it, or you want to come back and hear it again, you're welcome to do that. So welcome again to today's session. Radical resilience, building a trauma response. We're excited to have this information. Shannon Crossbear is our presenter again today. We're so grateful for you, Shannon. Thank you for all the time you've put in on this. She is a member of the FREDLA team, and I I feel it an honor to work with her. So I'm glad she's with us. Our agenda today is just doing welcome and introductions. If you have a moment, if you wouldn't mind putting into the chat your name and your state, helps us know all of the areas that we affect and where we need to do more marketing efforts. So then we're going to talk about the overview of trauma and resilience. Shannon's going to go through the 3 stages of coping with secondary trauma. And then we'll do some self-care, some strategies for supervisors and organizations. And then we'll talk what's coming up in our next family exchange. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Shannon, and just let me know when to change the slides.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lori, and welcome everybody. Welcome you in my language, Anin Indwe Maganak. I'm coming to you from my homelands on Lake Superior, the Lake Superior Ojibwe, and I'm so glad to be with everybody and continue the conversation that we began at the last exchange. Some of you may have been on that. We'll do a little bit of review, but we're really just going to be able to take a little moment to begin to talk about what we can do in terms of creating radical resilience. So next slide, please, Lori. First of all, I just want to greet everybody that I'm seeing the all the different areas that people are coming from to join us today, and that's so encouraging. So I'm glad to see everybody that is putting their introducing themselves in the chat box. So before we even get started, I want to just have us take a minute and connect with the compassion satisfaction before we even begin, because we're going to be talking about a lot about secondary traumatic stress, about trauma itself, about those kinds of things that really affect our compassion. So before we do that, we want to build upon our strengths. So I want you to just take a moment and think of a time in your job where you've assisted somebody else, and just, what you did at that point in time, and think about, a couple of people you may have worked with, and really they made progress in whatever their goals were because of that interaction that you had. Or you could think of 2 compliments you've received from people that you have worked with, from families, co-workers, community members, or someone in your job. And just we're not going to put these in the chat box unless you want to, but just in less than a few words for yourself, why did you choose to work in the organization that you did? Or choose to do the work that you're doing now? In the busyness of our days, we often forget. Some people are adding in that chat box because there was a need and to have a bigger impact in their community and the ripple effect. I know many of us come to this work because of our passion about something, because we want to change something, or because we want other families to experience something different than we experienced. So just hang on to those things about what really motivated, and again, Lori's, because you have lived experience, yes, but, that motivates us to, to do the work that we do. But I think it's important to just kind of remember the things that happen within the work that we do that really add to our feeling of satisfaction, like what we're doing is worthwhile, that we're, somehow that we're impacting the world in a way that is positive. So just hang on to that for yourselves. And it's a good exercise to do, especially on those days where you are having a really tough time with the work. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to do a brief review of kind of what we were talking about, why we're even having this conversation about trauma exposure. And we know that there's a high prevalence of trauma in our service population. So it's the trauma that we're dealing with the populations that we deal with, that's combined with the trauma that we may be bringing to the work, combined with the trauma that we're exposed to. And we know that that indirect trauma exposure is not the only workplace stressor that we have. And as we continue to see to be challenged with things like, a dwindling workforce, or a workforce that is not able to really meet the need, and what those stressors do to us. So all of these reasons are why we're kind of in the room having this conversation. And we know that it's not just a lack of job satisfaction, that's one thing, but it really does compromise our functioning and diminish our own quality of life. So next slide, please. So when we talk about trauma, just a reminder for those that weren't with us last time, that, we're talking about an experience that threatens our life or physical integrity, and really affects our ability to be able to cope and to be able to function. And we know that individual trauma can result from, anything, events, series of events, sense of circumstances. We talked about how trauma and stress are a natural reaction physically for us. How we used the example last time of a snake, like you're walking down a path and a snake is there, right? And what happens in our brain and in our bodies when, especially if we have a fear of snakes, when that snake startles us, right? And how those things are automatic and they're meant to protect us. But trauma really results when we get stuck in that stage of being constantly in that alert and are not able to come back into a normalcy or a self-regulation. So next slide, please. So, and we also talked about how, any range of situations could be traumatic. And the thing about this is that it's not just something that I could experience and you could experience, and we have the same experience. We're in the same automobile accident, for example, and I can experience that as being traumatic, and you may not experience that as being traumatic. So the trauma is the event, but the ongoing effects of that trauma are what make us be in a state of traumatic stress. So not any of these things that, we know now more than ever, that it's not just the trauma that we experience firsthand, but we can witness that trauma. We can even hear about the trauma. We can read about the trauma. Any of those things can can also affect our ability to be resilient in the face of trauma. So, and we know that the populations that and other families that we're dealing with have all of these things have probably happened at some point in time, or any of these things may have happened at some point in time. Next slide. So when we were talking about trauma, we also reviewed kind of the types of trauma that there's, that single event trauma, the chronic trauma that are stressful events. And we could really say that secondary traumatic stress is a chronic, right? Is a chronic, we're chronically exposed to stressful stories, stressful events, stressful situations that people are sharing with us. And it's complex, right? And when we talk about complex trauma, we're talking about exposure to multiple traumatic events that have long-term consequences. I think as a we can even apply this kind of to our population as a whole, if we're in a universal sense. And I say that because we have been exposed to multiple kind of nationwide traumatic events over the course of the last 20 some years. And 9/11, we can point to multiple kinds of things, the experiences that we had as a country as 9/11, subsequent wars that have happened after that, the number of incidents of violence in country at schools or in other situations that have happened, the witnessing of someone dying in the case of George Floyd, well, that was kind of flashed across the screen as we watched somebody lose their life. All of those kinds of things that we have been kind of very complex, that have built upon each other, that really have had long-term consequences, and we see those consequences played out in our population now. So, and we know about historical trauma being that experienced by a people based on their collective identity. So for those that have experienced genocide or other kinds of historical trauma that have been passed down in generations, intergenerational across. And we know now just through genetics and through epigenetics that this is indeed not just something we think happens, but that we actually have some physical evidence around that. And then we're talked about secondary traumatic stress, and that's, as a result of helping others, right, who have experienced trauma. And if we are in the fields that we're in, which is, behavioral health and mental health, then this is almost a given that we will be at least exposed, if not actually have symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. Next slide, please. So, but the good news is, as we all know, and we know this, that we know people that in our lives that have overcome stressful situations or traumatic events. I want people to take, we're going to take a couple of minutes. Let's take, Lori, let's take 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes to think of someone that you know personally that has overcome a stressful experience or traumatic event. And then I want you to get that person in your mind, and from your perspective, what do you think helps that person to adapt? Give you a couple minutes to think about it. I got some great answers up here. Acceptance of what was out and in somebody's control, a social support system, um, praying has helped, knowing that you're not alone and there are other people who survived the same trauma, engaged in therapy to understand and heal our trauma, and then dedicated our life to empowering others, family support, staying connected, intensive outpatient therapy, retraining the brain, so support network therapy, villages support, understanding that it was something that happened, but does not define who you are as a person.
Hello? Oh, sorry.
Positive support, getting engaged, therapy, serving, medication.
Okay, that's 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
Did good. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, everybody, that's great. Kindness, yeah, those are great things. So, does anybody want to come off mute and say anything or? Okay,
I will.
great.
My name is Melody. And one thing that I am wondering if you'll be talking about is that some of us are more resilient and some are more sensitive. And so we may go through the same experience, the, the same event, and have a different experience. And I'm from a family of 10. I'm thinking of one of my brothers, and yeah. But yes, I recently had something happen, and it really took me back unknowingly. It just took me back to my childhood, and I couldn't understand my big reaction until I worked through it with my therapist and um, went into some intensive dialectical behavior therapy and set up a lot of things for me to do when I start to feel out of control or that I'm losing control.
Yeah, thanks, Melody. That's great. Yeah, I think that's somebody else was wondering that same thing so they're thanking you for bringing up that question. And yeah, we all experience things differently from our perspective. There's so many variables in terms of how we react to something and our ability. The good news is that what we used to think was just kind of, you're either born with resilience or you're not. That that resilience is actually something you can begin to build upon, and that's the good news of it. But yes, we can be in the same, like I had said earlier, we can be in the same experience, but in terms of what happens, but we can individually experience that differently. So Joyce has her hand raised. Joyce?
So Joyce, you can come off mute. Or maybe you're just, there you go.
Hello. Hi, thank you. And so I just wanted to elaborate. I think all the comments are great, but as it relates to trauma, um, I used to work, I actually had the privilege of working with a doctor who actually ended up in a hospital. Um, she did 27 years, a psychologist, 27 years of working with children. And so after they got her medicated and regulated, the best conversations were with her. And one of the things she's always said was, you have to be aware of yourself, because if you don't, you collect emotional trauma from other people. And that was back in 2006. And so I have carried that with me. And So the first thing I do is think about what can I and what can I not control in this situation. Um, and so, as a clinician, that's something I encourage patients to do. And in order to do that, that's the first step that I see. And I may be wrong. Anybody can correct me. It's the first step in moving toward getting the support willfully. Is when you recognize, wait a minute, this is out of my control. Why am I trying to fight this? Or or control this situation that I can't. Let's look at what I can control so I can start making some change. So I just wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. That's very true and helpful. So,
Shannon,
Yes.
Carrie wants to know what do you mean by overcome? Did we talk about that earlier? And Carrie, is that something that you want to talk about some more?
yes. So, so Carrie, did you want to come off mute and because we will be talking about what we can do to kind of mitigate the experience, make it, less harmful to us.
Okay.
All right. So let's go to the next slide.
Oh, she can't come off mute.
Okay. All right. Well, Carrie, we're gonna have another opportunity too. So if I don't address it in a way that works for you, then we'll do that a little bit later. Okay. Great. So next slide.
Thanks, Shannon.
Yeah. So yeah, so when we're talking about resilience, again, I think it helps to define the term. It really is about being able to adapt to that difficult or challenging life experience. And, through our ability to be flexible and adjust, that doesn't mean that you don't experience the trauma or you don't experience something, whatever that is that's affecting you, but it means that you're able to kind of come back to that self-regulation, come back to that center point for yourself and be able to cope and continue to be able to operate. It doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to you anymore. And I remember a number of years ago, I had realized that a lot of the crisis that was in my life at the time, I contributed to, and I made a decision that I was gonna not do that anymore. And that didn't mean like within a month of making that decision, I had a car accident, a good important friend to me had a dramatic heart incident. And there was like three things that happened. What I noticed was my ability to deal with those things, to cope with that deal, to kind of take one by one and do what I needed to do under those circumstances had shifted. Whereas prior to that, if any one of those events would have kind of drawn me off base right away, and thrown me off kilter. So we know that it's your ability to continue to cope with tough times. And by applying strength and engaging support networks, and everybody talked about that earlier when they talked about who they, thought of in terms of having resilience. Many of you talked about kind of this inner strength and the support networks that they had, and that this was not resilience, was something that really other people and community helped one contributed to their ability to be resilient. And we want to keep that in mind because it really has to do with our work environments as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So next slide. So we know that again, here are some just additional things around resilience, that flexibility that we talked about. And it really is that ability that we see that some people bounce back from something a little bit easier than others. And that we're able to kind of draw, again, if they talk about that inner strength and to cope. Next slide, please. So, this idea of resilience and protective factors are kind of interwoven, because those protective factors that we can build upon are individual protective factors, are protective factors in, relationship and in community, are all things that help us adapt to and move forward when we're faced with those things. Next slide, please. But I want to take just a moment to say, to have some additional considerations when we talk about resilience. And I say this because, getting caught into that idea that resilience is always the responsibility of the individual is something we have to think deeply about, because especially in our BIPOC communities and other oppressed communities, we have to caution about, that unintended consequence when we're applying the word resilience, because it's almost as if, it's an individual trait and that we have an individual responsibility to be resilient, right? Some people would like to use the term resistant, especially when we come to those kinds of traumatic experiences that oppressed communities have. And the reason I say that is that you're constantly in a trauma-induced society, then it's kind of like, we've all seen the battery ram when somebody's trying to ram the castle doors, right? They have the big log, and they all get a hold of it and they try to smash the door in, and the door is so strong that they're not able to smash it in, but they keep trying, they keep battering at it and battering at it and battering at it. Well, eventually that castle door is going to go down. And that's kind of what we have to think about in terms of our populations that are and have experienced ongoing trauma. They're in the water of it, so to speak. They're the fish in the water of it. And so that trauma is a constant kind of thing. And to have the expectation that it's up to the individual to build enough resilience for that battering not to have an effect, I think is an additional burden that and doesn't get us to where we need to be. Kind of Joyce has put a comment in the chat about overcoming is that to regulate self as you go through the process of whatever the situation is. Yes, that's part of overcoming. Is not, you're not going to overcome the incident or what you're doing is overcoming your ability to come back to yourself, to be able to self-regulate and move through things. So next slide, please. So when we talk about coping with secondary traumatic stress, the thing I want to impress on people is that it's a collective experience. I use the example of, if you're a carpenter and you're, using a hammer all day, and you've done that for 20 years, you're pretty likely to have some carpal tunnel going on. You're going to have some physical effects from the work that you do. You're going to have some effects from that being in that environment. And I was thinking about it today because I was thinking about how we don't have OSHA, like for our secondary traumatic stress. If you're a welder and you work in a factory, the regulators are going to come in and they're going to say, you have to be wearing your protective glasses, because otherwise you're exposing yourself to the danger. But there's nobody telling us about the protective glasses, so to speak, around secondary traumatic stress. And in our workforce, in the work that we do, with families and, with each other, we're exposed to traumatic stress all the time. So our responsibility as workers is to think about, the fact that this is part and parcel for the work that we do. So when we're coping with or beginning to learn about how to deal with this, being in this secondary traumatic stress, we have these 3 stages that we talk about in terms of coping with it. That we need to have the knowledge about it, which is what we're kind of doing now, is giving you some information. There's certainly much more information out there to be had, but this is a starting place, right? And some skills, to be able to recognize and identify those risks and exposures that you have in the work that you do in your daily life, right? And then the 3rd stage we talk about is actually applying some of the skills that we know about, that can actually mitigate some of the effects of secondary traumatic stress. So next slide, please.
I have a question before we go on.
Sure.
One that came through the Q&A. It says, if you can build resilience, if you can build resilience with age and experience, can resilience also decrease over time? How and why does that occur?
Well, I think yes. I mean, I don't have anything right here to of evidence of that other than my observations. But yes, I do believe that resilience can, it goes back to what I was saying about the battering. Like, resilience is like that castle door that, you can, it can be very strong in resilience, but resilient. But if you have multiple kinds of things that are happening, or you're building upon 20 years, if you've taken on that stress, those stories, okay, and you're the container for those stories, and you have no way to release those stories, and all those stories that are traumatic in nature, and as a compassionate human being, if you're hearing those things, if you're seeing those things, if you're interacting with people who are experiencing those things, those are going to have an effect. And in terms of resilience, unless you're adding to the bucket, you're taking out of the bucket. So if you think about resilience as, a full bucket, and you've got a slow leak going on, sooner or later the bucket's going to be empty, right? But if you still have the leaks going on because you have this compassion, but you also have water being added all the time. That's compassion, satisfaction, and other self-care activities, and reflection, and community, and all those are the waters that are pouring into that bucket. Then even with those things that are taking out of that bucket, you still are going to have a full bucket. So, okay, next slide, please. So when we talk about the significance and kind of that first stage is when we're looking at what does that look like, then when you're looking at secondary traumatic stress. Next slide, please. So here are some of the definitions. That secondary traumatic stress is like results, we talked about that, about hearing traumatic experiences. It could be stories, any combination of things, even if you've decided you're not going to watch TV, so you're not exposed to, disasters or violent events. you're still going to hear about it because other human beings are hearing about it and they're going to share that. We know that frequent exposure to other people's trauma is the main driver of secondary trauma. That it really has to do with all of these kinds of things. Next slide, please. So we know that we're exposed to that and we're in the water of it, but how does secondary traumatic stress actually connect to post-traumatic stress disorder? And this is when it moves from that place where you can do some self-regulating or you have some ways of filling that bucket to a place where what's happening in your daily life is that you're having intrusive re-experiencing. And we know that if something has happened, recently, you're in an accident, you're going to think about it for a while, it's going to be, but this is like continuing, that it continues, that you continue to think about. I often say that you wake up with the family that you're helping in your head, and you go to sleep with the family that you're helping in your head, or others that you're helping. That you find yourself reacting to cues that may, some people have used the terminology triggers, but we try to not use that language just because in and of itself it can ignite some things in people. So it's just those things that just come out of the blue and you don't even think that they're related. It might be a smell, it might be a sight, it might be a sound. When we talked about the snake, it was the next day you see a stick on the road, and before your brain gets the message that it's a stick and not a snake and it's not moving, it looks like one because it's got the same curve to it, and you've already put yourself into the flight and fight state, that your brain, your breathing is increased, you can come back pretty easily. But what happens if you get a cue like that and you can't self-regulate? Then you're talking about that's a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah,
And then,
Melody says that a good word instead of triggered is activated.
yes, that is a great word. I was trying to find it, Melody, in I kept thinking ignite, but I like activated even better. So thank you.
You're welcome. I do trainings with certified peers, and they let me know, especially the ones that grow up in gang areas, that they do not like the word
Triggered. Yeah.
There's a lot. The more that we learn, the more that we can change our language and think deeply about it. That's being trauma informed. So I appreciate that. Another thing that shows up is kind of this avoidance of memories or thoughts or feelings. This is where we see, and that avoidance many times can be unhealthy. It can be that avoidance, maybe even workaholism or substance abuse or other kinds of unhealthy addictions. We find those are all avoidance measurements. So if you see that that's increasing in your life, or your need to do something, anything in an obsessive way, that really has to do with trying to avoid thinking about or avoid the memories about an event. And we see that arousal, if you find yourself or others might be more easily led to anger, or and those that something is a change in behavior that began or is worsening after that event, even the exposure to somebody else's event. So next slide, please. So, you're under this high pressure all the time, and it's important to know some of the signs and symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. And that's kind of now you have the information about it. The stage 2 is to really look and see where you can see it showing up. So next slide, please. So these are all, we like to think about how does that show up in it, of course, because we're whole human beings that are physical, emotional, behavioral, we have mental needs, all of these areas we're gonna see the impacts. Maybe not all of them and maybe not all at once, but thinking about how does this affect us? Why is it that this is so important? It really has to think about that fatigue, that numbness in our physical, what's happening, are we having any kinds of things? This is the kind of the results of secondary traumatic stress. Those emotional roller coasters, you may find at work that you're more hypersensitive, or you're getting into more conflicts with coworkers, or you're fearing, you're having anxiety and irritability more, or all of the kinds of elevated startle responses, all of these things. Next slide, please.
So there's a long message here from Joyce in chat. You might want to read that.
I'm going to read it out loud, Joyce.
Okay.
I appreciate the ability to look at the flaws, behavior, or situations from an IFS point of view, which focuses on viewing all the behaviors as have some form of positive purpose. For example, one may drink to cope with emotional distress to avoid managing those feelings. Discussing with them how it is helpful helps them feel empowered, get to know how it has caused harm as well. Therefore, starting the transition of thinking of behavior, drinking in another way, thereby moving the thought process away from the drinking behavior over time. That is resilience. What do you think? Is this a proper way to move to resilience? Joyce, I think it's one, yes, I think it's one of the ways. It's kind of that motivational interviewing which really has to do with, I always talk about using your love skills, right? Listen, offer, validate somebody else's experience, and then empower them to make the decisions and changes they need to make for themselves. So next slide, please. Oh, you're welcome. So, yeah, so again, it has to do with that, again, thoughts. My point here with these two slides, and you'll have them to reflect upon in deeper, but it really is, it really does show you that it affects all aspects of your being, right? On all levels, about how this can show up and why it's so important that we're talking about it. So next slide, please. So, okay, so let's just say, we see this going on in ourselves or others, right? That this idea of secondary traumatic stress, what are the kind of some of the strategies around mitigation is such an interesting word, but really saying this is part of what may happen and often does happen to us. So how can we lessen the negative effects? What can we do to actually build up our resilience? So next slide, please. And it has to do with self-care. I mean, and it's not, and I say this because it's not, I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's not just the responsibility of the individual, but self-care, I love this quote, is an ethical imperative. And meaning that we have an obligation to those we serve to take care of ourselves, right? I mean, and that does not mean that we're 100% of the time. It means that we are in an active state of taking care of ourselves, that we're aware that we're doing it, that we see when we're not doing well, so that we don't. If we had, any other major kind of thing going on that was contagious, let's say that we had measles, I'll just say measles, that we had measles, that we certainly, if we're in the contagion stage of measles, we certainly wouldn't go around all the people that we care about and give them measles, I would think. We wouldn't do that. So why would we want to expose people to our unwellness and what that can do? We have a responsibility, and that doesn't mean, like I said, 100% of the time, but being aware that we have an obligation to take care of ourselves because we're in the position of assisting other people, other human beings. And we can't teach what we don't know, and we can't lead where we won't go. So that means that we have to examine our levels of trauma and how they may be affecting the work that we do. Yes,
Nina says we can't pour
Yeah.
from an empty cup, which is why I don't mind taking time off if needed.
Yeah, exactly. So next slide, please. So again, this is, being at the end of your rope, we know everything here, the relation, everything that we're doing that just says, I'm afraid, I'm fried, this is not working well. So next slide. Yeah, and this is the self-care is not the things that we are most likely to fall into, like drinking more coffee. That is I'm guilty of that some days, and that's not self-care. All of those kinds of things. Or mentally, I love the all or nothing Nancy popping up, meaning, you either do 100 things or you can't do anything. And we know where that leads. So next slide. As opposed to what it looks like when we are taking care of ourselves, that, we are doing the things that we need to do that we know contribute to our health. Thinking positively about yourself, being able to exercise and sleep, and, eating good food, being able to, meet our needs in those ways. Walk it, I like it. Joyce was talking, walk it like you talk it. Yes, self-care is so important, right? So next slide, please. So the thing about self-care is you have to do it intentionally and frequently. So really creating your own opportunities, right? It's this idea that we all talk about self-care, and go deeper than getting your nails done, and a massage, but we all talk about self-care, but we don't really plan our self-care very well, and we're not intentional about it. We seem to address it kind of after the fact, after we're kind of not feeling well or burnt out. So you had been sent the balance wheel prior to this session, and I'm hoping you had a chance to fill it out, because I want to give you about 7 minutes. If you filled it out already, I'm going to ask you to look at it, reflect on it a bit, and just share in the chat box without hitting send, because we're going to do a chatterfall, which means that at the end of this, Lori will hit a button and they'll all come up at the same time. So hold off in sending it. But to answer the questions around, reflect a little bit, answer the questions around, did anything surprise you about doing the assessment? And was there something that concerned you about doing the assessment? Or anything else you want to share about the experience of doing this assessment? And the thing about an assessment that I'd like to share is, to me, it's just turning on the light. When I was a kid, I used to be in my room and I'd see this dark shadow in the corner, and and I'd stay kind of paralyzed because I didn't want to get up and turn the light on because I just knew it was a monster. But at some point in time, I I would be brave enough to get up and turn on the light, and I'd see that it was a pile of clothes, right? So all an assessment is turning on the light. We see what's there. We have all kinds of choices. Like I had choices then. It was a bunch of clothes in the corner that I could have, turned the light off and said, fine, at least I know what it is. Or I could have thrown the clothes in the closet, and then gone back to bed. Or I could have taken the clothes and actually hung them up, and took care of it that way. I usually chose the second one, but the point is that you have all these options, and all the assessment is kind of looking at. So, yeah, so we're gonna spend,
I've got 6.5 more minutes. I mean, 5.5 more minutes left.
okay, 5.5 more minutes for you to reflect upon that and, add your comments in the chat box, but don't hit send. If you have not done the balance wheel yet, I would encourage you to start now and keep these questions in mind as you complete that. I kind of wish I would have some music. I feel like I should hum something.
Go for it.
Yeah.
You could do some drumming. Are you a drummer?
Yeah, I'm a drummer. Okay, Annette has to jump to another meeting. Glad you were with us, Annette. And Tristan. See you next time.
Okay, about 3 more minutes.
Did you do that balance wheel, Lori?
Did I do it?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm sorry, I did not.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's another Q&A question. We'll address that as soon as we get off of our 7 minutes. Oh yeah, I did answer that.
So recently I had a flat tire and I often think about this balance wheel and my flat tire because the flat tire was only flat on one side. And anyway, when I removed it, I had to put the donut wheel on to get the tire to be fixed. And what it makes me think about is this balance wheel.
We're driving around with 3 inflated tires and 1 donut.
Yeah, that, but more importantly, thinking about, I can get where I need to get on a donut, but you're not supposed to drive, I think, over 50 miles or something. I
Right.
can't remember. And the fact is that, first of all, I've never met anybody, and if anybody is on this call and you have a perfectly balanced wheel, I really want to talk to you.
Yeah.
But the thing about about our balance is really, you can get down the road with a tire that isn't balanced. But the fact is that the tire will not last as long and the wear and tear will be more, so the likelihood of you getting a flat is higher when
Yeah.
the tire is not balanced. Well, it's the same with us. Okay, so.
Okay, so it's been 7 minutes. Go
Okay.
for your chatterfall.
All right, go for the chatterfall.
Everybody put your comments in and then at the same time, we'll all hit go. Okay,
Okay, ready.
ready, set, go. Everybody hit send.
So we have one comment that Christy said that she loved the personal balance wheel. Nothing really surprised her. Just that she needed to focus more on reaching her potential. And Amelia, I like the analogy because donuts like survival mode for me. But she liked bigger and proper gallons, east. The direction of these, she's still fine. Oh, Marilyn's still filling in the colors. So it really is about this. It's not meant, the assessment is not meant to, to do anything other than to turn on the light and to think about whether you want to, in one of those quadrants, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, in one of those quadrants that, you might want to take a look at in terms of balance. I mean, like I said, I've never met anybody who is perfectly balanced, and at any given point in our lives, we're probably stronger in one area than we are in the other. But just understanding about, choices that you can make. And I usually try to do something similar to this in terms of an assessment for myself on a fairly regular basis. I was doing it quarterly, and then I started to do it every 6 months. I think I should go back to quarterly because it's easy for me to get off track. But to make some goals. And sometimes there's been things that I've looked at and I'm like, I'm not ready to do anything there right now in that quadrant. So that works really well for me. And yeah, and I keep going down the road. So thinking about, but again, this is a little assessment. This goes back to what I was saying about being intentional, to really do things that says, am I taking a look at this area of my life? Am I really looking at what my exposure level to secondary traumatic stress is on a daily basis, and what my bucket filling, what my self-care, and what I'm consciously doing to create situations and opportunities to replenish. So next slide, please. So we know that, some of this has to do with adjusting our perspectives about accepting our limitations. I mean, especially for those of us that are in helping fields, and we care so deeply, and we know the importance of the work that we do. And so knowing that, even things like setting our own boundaries around the hours that we're working. Yes, many of us have, because of the work that we do, we have made conscious decisions or engaged in employment that says we are going to work outside of the normal 9 to 5, and we're going to be available. But we don't think that that's like above and beyond, but rather exchanging and say, well, if I'm working, and doing a group on a family support group, say on Wednesday night, then I really need to not work Wednesday morning, or, whatever, however that works out for you. But, really knowing about how to focus on the process that you're in and not just on the outcomes. So next slide, please. In our emotions, what are we doing to manage those boundaries? And you can have empathy and boundaries at the same time. It's honoring yourself and the other person. When I don't have the capacity, and I'm really beyond my capacity, and I attempt to be available for someone else, and I'm not honest about that capacity, I am not helping them. I'm not helping me, and I'm not helping them. So finding those processes of how we can really be empathetic, even in the idea of setting my boundaries. Being able to say things like, even in my work now, being able to say, well, you can have 5 minutes of me now, or you can have 40 minutes of me later, right? And which would you prefer, the 5 minutes or the 40, and really being able to, to be able to set those limits. And also this idea of emotionally doing something very different between your meetings. If you're sitting in intense conversations or therapeutic sessions or counseling sections or family to family, and you're hearing these stories and you're experiencing and sharing and being available to the trauma of others, what is it that you can do to stop all of that and do something very different? It may be something recreational, it may be listening to music, it may be dancing, and maybe it's really doing something that is outside of not more of the work that you're doing, or even a complete break, but rather to actually experience something different. Next slide, please. And, we think about physical well-being, and it's not just the absence of disease, but it really is, wellness is that vibrancy that we feel, that, and understanding the basics of food, water, movement, rest. Are you doing those things? Basic food, water, movement, rest, and connection, because our physical well-being is increased by connection. So next slide, please. This has to do with what we had done in the very beginning. I'd like you to go back to that exercise in the beginning. And maybe a practice that you do is once a week, you think about yourself, about the compassion satisfaction. So, we're all building upon the strengths, how many times, or maybe recalling, 1 or 2 or 3 different positive experiences that you had in the last work week, right? A lot of times we don't take time to do that. We come to completion with something, we don't even celebrate it. We come to completion because there's so much work to do. We move on to the other thing, right? But the celebrations and the acknowledgement of when something went right. We build upon the strength. We build upon those acknowledgments. Next slide, please. So organizations themselves, and I know that some on this call may be in positions of authority within organizations, or have some equal opportunities to shift organizational thinking. We know that their likelihood to continue to expose people to trauma and experiences like that. So organizations that fail to create physically safe space, that's one thing, but I think also psychologically and emotional self spaces where people can really be able to recognize that they're going to have direct exposure to trauma, and how the staff suffer and what they can put in place to, um, to minimize that. Next slide, please. So it really means that as an organization, like if you're in a family-run organization or any other agency, organization, healthcare, what's being done to really address these issues of burnout and compassion fatigue, not just talk about it, but actually put things in place that improve the opportunities for job satisfaction and for growth. So next slide, please. And so some of what that looks like is really being able to remain, present for the folks that you work with. If you're in a supervisor position, to really take the time to do reflective practices and learn about reflective supervision. And it's okay to ask if you don't understand their experience. That's what that cultural humility is about. That don't assume that you know what's happening, but also to be able to use in a reflective, beautiful question kind of way to get at what someone may be experiencing. Be brave, be brave as a supervisor. Be brave enough to be able to understand that there's a power differential, that there are things like privilege and racism and systemic oppression that are at play, and that you can discuss that. Knowing sometimes that your ability to affect that change may be minimal or compromised, but even that compassion of being able to acknowledge is so important. That's why listening to each other and stories and using those love skills is important. And to really address those things. So at the same time, at the same time that battery ram is trying to break down the door of resilience there, that you're actually establishing things that build up that resistance. And that means, addressing the factors that people are coming in with in terms of trust and transparency. So next slide, please. So, and I think somebody said it early on in the conversation about how important it is to be aware of your own biases, your own issues of privilege or oppression or trauma, all of that kind of thing. And this last statement, which is about making sure if you are a white supervisor, or you have some other privileged identity, that you don't rely upon BIPOC supervisors to seek guidance and education about institutional racism, white supremacy, and colonization. And I say that because oftentimes, it's very easy to contribute to secondary traumatic stress of people of color who are responsible not just for themselves and their experience, but then are relied upon to reflect whole populations. And that can be extreme, like, for example, taking the person who is Spanish speaking and always using them to do interpretation, or to ask the person who is indigenous in your community all of the questions about how one should interact with other indigenous people, or all those kinds of things really have they take a toll, because you continue to have to educate in addition to the rest of your job. So yes, and Melody is saying there's many trainings that people can attend to, and finding, finding what I call cultural brokers is important too. So
Melody has her hand up also.
see that, Melody.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, since COVID happened, there are many trainings across the United States that are online that are super valuable. They have people from these cultures that are educating. Yeah, and I love it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'll go back to, and I say this whenever I'm talking about a particular culture, is I always go back to my friend Menage Hill, and from Standing Rock, and what he always said, which is, if you want to learn about us, go to the library. There's lots of good books. But if you want to know and understand us, come and spend time with us. So any opportunities you have to really build and be in relationship with those that maybe have a different experience than you have are so important. So next slide, please. So, I think it really is up to our organizations to really be aware that the staff that we work with have their own trauma histories, and have this, especially in the field that we're in, have this ongoing trauma exposure. Um, Build a more diverse pool of candidates that helps mitigate and those programs, and train your supervisors about how to create safe spaces for your providers, including those things that I talked about in terms of reflective supervision and cultural humility. Next slide, please. And then
Joyce has a comment.
Sure, Joyce.
Actually, it's a question. I heard you say supervisors, and um, every last one of us have trauma. It reminded me of a statement I said to um, one of my coworkers here. So my question is, with all the training that goes on in our field of operation, the trainings that are available, what do you say, or how do you encourage staff or executive directors, people in leadership, to apply the skill of what you're talking about in order to communicate with someone who may or may not have experienced trauma? And the things I said to many of our coworkers is, every person in this world has experienced some form of trauma. Whether they have allowed it to be traumatizing for them is another subject. But being that we have experienced some form of trauma, it is important that we approach individuals with that trauma informed care type of thinking. And even with our coworkers, and I see very little of that in any job I've been in. Very little. People are they can be very abrasive or lack empathy when people are going through. So, what is your suggestion there?
Well, I think that you answered the question in the question, and that is that we have to become a trauma informed world, right? We have to
Mhm.
really understand that trauma is that it exists. That if you're trauma informed, you're constantly thinking about the why of somebody's behavior, not the what of their behavior, right? the why, because it's really about what happened to people. And so you do look at the world differently, and especially given that two things. One, we're dealing with people who are traumatized, but also we have our own trauma. But the other piece of that is recognizing that we did a study, and this was a number of years ago, I think about over 20 now. And it was we were at the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health, and there was a big conference, and there was like 900 families in attendance at that particular conference. And we did we asked the question, we did some surveys, and then we also did some focus groups. And the question was around whether they experienced trauma prior to their intersect with a helping system, or was their trauma an experience as a result of the intersection with the helping system. That's a pretty, and what we got was very, it confirmed what many have felt, and that was that the systems themselves were traumatizing. Trying to access services, getting the wrong services, being treated in a certain way, but beyond that, some real, and we knew these are people that were in community health situations, residential situations, all of the above, and the trauma that was happening as a result of intersecting with what was supposed to be a serving system was pretty eye-opening and disturbing. So now we're at the point where we're really talking about how do we become a trauma-informed community, and think places like the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, really great resource places that have just a lot of information, accessible information, and opportunities to really learn more deeply about how we can do that. Everything from trauma 101, everybody should have, right?
Right.
To actually what are some deeper kinds of therapies that have to do with treating trauma.
The way that the service system is set up, at least in most places that I've learned about, are pretty siloed. And so when you have to go from one system to another service system, and you have to tell your story all over again, that's the re-traumatization that really happens to a lot of families.
So when you talk about, because we're talking about residual or secondary trauma with at your job, when you start talking about it stands out for me because I work with so many people, so many social workers, and I will be my team of social workers that I supervise. We will be doing more of these trainings because I just love this. But in trying to communicate that with a group of coworkers, regardless of where they are, who they are, application seems to be the piece that misses. Like we do all these trainings and no one applies what they've learned, or they never learned it. I don't know which one it is.
Yeah, I think Joyce, that's where I would say that's why I encourage people to, if at all possible, to find a way to have reflective practice, because reflective practice really is an opportunity to kind of apply the things around trauma, being trauma informed. And it is a practice, right? It's a practice. And and leadership, that's why I say leadership has a responsibility in being able to create trauma informed organizations and agencies. And that responsibility has to be and one is reflective supervision. There are other things that people can do that really help to, and I was just thinking in my own head, what I went to was, the child welfare worker who
Mhm.
was in the system themselves and then becomes a child welfare worker, and maybe they get into um, child protective services. And
Right.
then they start out with the intention and full, heart and everything because of their own experience, that they don't want to replicate that for somebody else. But after a period of time, with all the kinds of things that contribute to their stress, no opportunities to really reflect upon, or
Mhm.
be encouraged to do those things, that in time, that worker becomes just like the worker that they experienced in their own case,
Mm.
right?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so you end up with this person who you can't understand, that they're overworked, they're bitter, they're angry, they're
Mhm.
having all those experiences. And so thinking about, how our systems themselves have to become trauma informed. And
Right.
that's really the objective of bringing the conversation of trauma and secondary trauma to the forefront, so that we can continue to address those things and become healthy, not just individuals, but healthy then workforces and organizations and people that serve people, right?
Shannon, we have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, so go to the next slide. I don't think there's very many slides left anyway. This is just kind of, again, some activities, making sure that everybody's included, doing some assessments. There are some assessments out there, and you can find them online, and at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, in terms of organizational assessments. Next slide. These are all the challenges, lack of support, all of those kinds of things that we've already talked about. Next slide. Yeah, and this is just, again, making a commitment. I think it's so, in this idea of intentionality, knowing that these are things that you can commit to, finding an accountability buddy, encouraging, finding, and keep saying it. I mean, I say it people that know me know that, I'm putting a training together, and they usually, on any training, they'll talk about self-care, but they usually talk about it at the end and not at the beginning. And so every time I have an opportunity, I'm like, why do we put this last on the agenda? If it really is a priority, why are we putting it to the last, right? Why? Because we're still reinforcing that first you work and then you get to take care of yourself, instead of you should be taking care of yourself as you're working. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just, again, encouragement to make a holistic plan for yourself. Take that balance wheel, maybe create an action plan for yourself. Or maybe you take that balance wheel and you say, it's okay, my action plan is to take that balance wheel assessment in 6 months, right? Whatever the plan is, the idea is really thinking about yourself in this holistic way. And a lot of times when we think about self-care and making that plan, we have to think about not just that physical, I'm going to go to the gym thing, but how are we taking care of these other things as a whole and healthy human being? And yes, the 8 dimensions of wellness are also helpful, as Melody has reminded us. The next slide. So an empty lantern provides no light. So that self-care is that fuel, and we're really lighting the way for ourselves and others. And so let's make sure that we're using that fuel. So next slide.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, Shannon, helping us to go through this deeper dive of trauma in secondary trauma in our workplace, and how to address some of that for ourselves and for the people that we may supervise and work with. And I really appreciate your time and efforts for this. So thank you so much. On our next family exchange will be on October 30th. And we have an exceptional presenter to talk to us about protecting your passion and about staying in this work and what it takes to stay in this work. So we're excited for that. And if you are registered today, you're registered for the complete series of these, but please feel free to share this registration link to anybody who might need it or wants to join us. Again, look for your certificate of completion from Bridget. You'll get a copy of the presentation that was used for this event, and a copy of the recording will be available. So please complete the survey as it comes to you. It helps us know how to get better and what we need to focus more on. So please fill that out. It takes a few minutes, and we really appreciate your time. And then here's all the ways to connect with NTAC. If you are in need of some help from NTAC, some technical assistance, please call them. They will put you in touch with the right people, and you'll get in where you need to go. And again, Shannon, thank you so much for all of your time and effort the last 2 months. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you all next month. Yay. And it'll be Halloween almost. So yay. Okay. Have a good day, everybody, and talk to you soon.